So I want to welcome everybody to this part of our Appalachian Heritage Day programming at Southern West Virginia Community and Technical College here in Logan. We are featuring today a wide variety of artists and authors and musicians and scholars and just general experts in about any field you can think of relating to Appalachia. And we have a first-rate lineup all day long. Anywhere we've gone, we find these wonderful people. So this session, we'll hear from Dr. Paul Rakes. His lecture is titled, "The Meanest County in the Nation, Fayette's Coal Mining Frontier." A little background about Dr. Rakes. A third-generation coal miner, Paul Rakes, professor at WVU Tech, worked as a coal miner for 20 years before leaving mining to earn his PhD in history at West Virginia University. His research focuses both on technology and the labor culture of coal miners in West Virginia. He has produced such professional journal articles as Technology in Transition, The Dilemmas of Early 20th Century Coal Mining for the Journal of Appalachian Studies, West Virginia Coal Mine Fatalities, The Subculture of Danger, and a Statistical Overview of the Pre-Enforcement Era, Casualties on the Homefront, World War II era coal disasters in West Virginia for West Virginia history. Book chapters include A Combat Scenario, Early Coal Mining and the Culture of Danger in Culture, Class, and Politics in Modern Appalachia, and A Hard-Bitten Lot, Non-Strike Violence in Early Southern West Virginia Coalfields in Blood in the Hills, A History of Violence in Appalachia. Dr. Rakes has served as a consultant for several televised video productions focusing on coal mining history, and is regularly called upon by various news agencies to provide insight into current mining developments. Additionally, he contributed a short memoir regarding growing up in the coalfields in Anthology of Appalachian Writers. So we at Southern are very, very honored and thrilled to have Dr. Rakes with us, and he will now be doing his presentation titled Meanest County in the Nation, Fayette County's Coal Mining Frontier. Welcome, Dr. Rakes. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, good afternoon. First, let me express my appreciation to Professor Kirk for his invitation to speak at this event celebrating Appalachia. And I have to add, Brandon Kirk possesses great skill in convincing scholars to participate. Although I'm currently completing my final research work, I have, for all intents and purposes, moved into the final stages of my scholarly efforts, particularly presentations. In fact, about 3 years ago in Matewan, I did a short presentation on mining technology, and I proclaimed that would be my last presentation. Well, apparently Brandon Kirk had a different idea, and he's very good at it. I will say that. One of the reasons I'm winding down, I am, after all, and I'm certain that WVU Tech students would agree, I'm older than dirt. National park tours, mine sites such as the Kmore mine, I remember it operating. Steel Tech's the first mine I worked in. It now has several historical markers around it. It's part of a historical tour in Mount Hope. And that has a bit of an effect on one and say, well, you know, time is getting short. Truth to tell, I've never really been comfortable in the role of scholar. As was mentioned, the third generation miner. I was surrounded by miners in my youth. Then the 20 years in the industry seemed to have precedence over the effect academia has had on me. The bond that I have with miners remains. It remains stronger than that of the scholarly world. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but and to that end, this was taken shortly before I left Matter River Mine and actually went off to do a PhD. I can't walk too far, I'm told, but I'm standing all the way in the back part over on your right, looking behind someone there. Actually, it was within a month, I think, that I left mine. I have the utmost respect for those men. And again, the bond I have with them will remain always stronger than that was common. I just added the one back on the Rakes homestead there with the blind rooster. What I really miss is the hare, but you know what happens to blind roosters. They become the guest of honor at Sunday dinner, but it was a good pet for a while. I also remember quite vividly coming into my graduate work in Appalachia and having scholars attempt to explain the Pittston strike to me. It had only been about 3 or 4 years since the strike, and for the life of me, I couldn't recall seeing any of those scholars on the picket line, blocking coal trucks, or spending time in the jails and the courthouses of Lebanon and Abington, Virginia. But they certainly seemed determined to enlighten me about the whys and wherefores and hows of the strike. And I was particularly interested in a broadcast journalism professor who decided to explain unions to me. I had to make a bit of a transition there and be willing to listen without saying, you don't know anything about it, you weren't there. I was, and I didn't see it that way. But my interest in everyday coal camp violence actually sharpened while doing my PhD research. And that research was primarily into mine disasters. And so I placed this coal mine or coal camp violence to the side for a while. For that matter, the first genuine bloody fight among adult males that I witnessed as a boy occurred near the company store and the theater at Scarborough, which is the River Coal Camp, where I was born. Another factor quite influential in this project with everyday violence in the coal camps came from the fact that in my own mind, I separated the experience told me by my rough and tumble maternal grandfather. By that I mean the stories he told me of his role in strikes, particularly during the mining wars. I mentally separated those from what I learned of his violent episodes during everyday life in the coal towns. They just seemed to be two separate topics to me. And I decided, since it's my last presentation, to put up everything. And here the wicked old rascal is. And I say that with love, but it's the truth. To be honest, I thought that Grandpa was stretching the blanket a lot until I actually researched the rascal. And I found he was indeed a regular visitor to the red light district of Cinder Bottom in McDowell, which most folks are familiar with. He was indeed a hard-drinking, card-playing ruffian. Actually, he was even meaner and more wicked than I had believed. He killed 2 men for certain. I'm aware of that. I could track that down. The other 2 is more family story. He told me in passing, but I haven't been able to verify it. And again, he got away with all of that on the frontier coal camps. In this project, I found myself increasingly focused onto a broader scholarly research theme. And it's more than just the simple presence of violence. In historical research, we often develop models. And these models are based on conclusions about conditions and events in a given area and a given time period. And then there's the tendency to loosely apply those to similar locations and sometimes to other time periods, but certainly to similar locations. Creating these models and then extrapolating and applying those models to other areas is risky, and it can be misleading. We can come to the wrong conclusions about what historically did occur. Almost all research of violence in the coalfields has centered on periods of labor strife. And that's a different dynamic. That's something different than the everyday confrontations that go on in coal camps, especially, once again, the frontier camps. And it's important to keep that in mind. These are frontier coal camps. They're new. It's not what comes later when they mature. There's no doubt that one of the reasons that the studies of violence previously have been, the reason it's been related to labor studies during times of labor strife is that that's where the records are. And so so historians can easily find that. And to be sure, if I had known how difficult it would be to research everyday violence in the coal camps, the early coal camps, I never would have tackled it. Tracking down primary sources involved every molecule of actual detective skills I possess. And it was a long and difficult process. For that matter, the pattern, and there is a pattern, of lumping all early coal operators together is risky as well. Certainly, it's a significant mistake to have the idea that the coal camps of Sam Dixon's New River Company and Justice Collins, his coal towns and so forth. Let me add, the despicable Justice Collins. And if he can hear me from the grave, that's too bad, I'll still say. They're not the same. The coal operations of the immediate area of Glynn, Jeanne, and Fayette County were quite different under Collins' rather short control than after he sold them to Dixon's New River Company. But you have folks who are trying to take what happened under Collins and apply it to the era of New River. One of the interesting sideline stories about the two, there was a lengthy court battle that went on between Dixon and Collins after the sale of, if you're familiar with the area, Whipple Mine, Oakwood Mine, that region. And then there was other property involved. And there'd been lots of argument in court. And during that period, Sam Dixon threw Justice Collins into the motor pit down at Thurman. And I guess Collins pushed it one time too many. And I would give $100 or more to see Collins try to climb out of that dirty motor pit covered with grease and coal dust and the whole 9 yards. I will say he was the most unpleasant individual whose records I've studied. I just was glad to finish with it. Dixon, on the other hand, he knew mining. He had his faults. But those coal camps of New River were not the same as they had been under Dixon. It's also good to keep in mind that most early southern West Virginia coal camps bore a strong resemblance to the more nationally popular mining camps and to a degree even the coal cow towns of the American West. Even during those early periods, you can see here, it's a little hazy, I guess, but that's a cattle drive coming down the streets of Mount Hope in 1904. So there's even some cattle business going on in the area. In fact, despite Hollywood's efforts, mining camps in the West, the most dangerous camps are excuse me, I didn't say that right, I apologize. The mining camps were more dangerous than the cow towns. In other words, Bodie, California, the most dangerous town in the Old West, was much deadlier than Deadwood, South Dakota, or the cow town of Dodge City. I've wrestled with some figures, but the Fayette County coal camps from Rush Run to Quinamont indicate that there may be a FBI homicide index higher than that of even Bodie, California, which again was the most dangerous town in the West. But of course, we're talking about more than one town, one camp, whereas Bodie, that's just one. So it's a difficult figure to wrestle with. The coal camps that I'm referring to this evening, I get the wrong thing. Actually, this is a map primarily what we talk about. These coal camps you see along the river, eventually that expands up into what is today Oak Hill and Mount Hope, Lindsay. And these early camps in this area are where much of the gunplay occurred. And again, none of these are mature camps. They are quite simply mining camps on a frontier. They're not frequented by lots of family units. And the heyday of gunplay will ease off whenever family units begin to come in and coal camps mature. Talking about, and I'm referring to these males who come in who are single, or they're males who are bachelors, and they drink a lot, and naturally there are repercussions from that. but I am not leaving out the females. There were some tough customer women who came to these early coal camps, and they got in on the violence. There's an old mining camp refrain that's more common in the American West, but it applies here too. And the refrain is, first came the miners to work in the mine. Next came the ladies to work on the line. And of course, many of those first females coming in would be professional women. And those professional women knew not only how to rob their customers, most importantly, they knew how to handle a firearm and particularly a straight razor. And there's plenty of cases of this occurring. Now, again, but the setting is dominated by single men and males living as bachelors. Contemporary critics and many early Appalachian historians often suggested that this coal camp violence represented the violent nature of mountaineers. Well, that idea has certainly been put pretty much to rest, but it's worth reminding folks that in actuality, the early Fayette County coal camps included a mixture of predominantly native-born, American native-born, not West Virginia, but Native American-born. That's going to run together and not sound right. They are natives of America, both white and black. They dominate early on, but they tended to come from the South, especially blacks from North Carolina and Alabama, but lots of white Southerners as well. Also, there were those who migrated in from Ohio and Pennsylvania. All one has to do is look at the list of casualties in early mine disasters, in which will list where the nativity of these different folks, and you'll see immediately that, hey, it's a mixture all the way from Scotland and elsewhere. When I began this study, I anticipated finding a pattern of violence between these various groups. Italians versus blacks, or blacks versus whites. That's what I expected to find, but that's what serious scholarly research will do for you. What I found, with only a few exceptions, is that conflict occurred primarily within the specific groups. Whites against whites, Italians against Italians, and so forth. By the turn of the 20th century, there was an increasing mix of humanity that wandered into these established operations along the New River, and especially Dunlop Creek, which empties into New River. It runs by way of Glen Jean and down to Thurman. There were several mine shafts, powerhouses, mule barns, and other support buildings that were under construction. These sites were bustling. They came to resemble the popular image of gold or silver strikes in the American West. More established areas such as Glen Jean and the nearby Dunlop facilities, they provided boarding opportunities, and I think I have a boarding house. Well, influx of humanity, I was saying. Always happens, you get them mixed up, don't you? Let me see if I made it there. No, sorry. Giving me modern technology is like giving a monkey a rocket ship. He'll get it off the ground, but he's going to crash it, and I've crashed already. So I'll just go with this. I thought I had a boarding house up there. But there, at the same time, there are contractors who are sinking various shafts. There are carpenters at work on a variety of buildings. There are construction crews on Sam Dixon's White Oak Railway extension, and it added to a housing crunch. I mean, it's just almost impossible to find housing. So as a result, many of the earliest workers often had to follow the relatively common practice of shantying. This, of course, is not some of the early miners, but this is a shanty that's left over, and it's the perfect example of these early shanties, miner shanties. Now, you'll see some of them in museums today, outdoor museums and so forth, that show a miner's shanty as something rather small, and they're correct, but they're pretty nice compared to what this would be. These shanties became common in these infant mining sites. There's a financial investment that's coupled with the time and the effort involved in building houses that delays the widespread construction of coal towns with housing, such as people have in the popular image. Drift mines entering an exposed outcrop of coal had the benefit of producing profit almost with first strike of the pick. And as a result, some of the late 19th century Fayette miners and early 20th century, they lived for a while in these personally constructed lean-tos or large shipping crates or these shanties. Plus those who are putting the mine in place, they need to concentrate on using the available timber for the use on the mine's physical plant, things of that sort. The elementary housing requires less lumber. That's pretty easy to build. And so many of the earliest miners, they just find anything to produce a small shanty and live in that. And keep in mind, you're going to put these single men, males in close proximity in these buildings. Even the West Virginia State Supreme Court, in hearing some of the criminal cases that involved shootings in these shanties and so forth, they would not refer to this as a house. In the legal language, it is a shanty. They distinguish between the two. And a lot of men, of course, will room together in these. In this type of frontier setting, and again, that's sort of my theme here, it's a frontier, you have young men who are bound to a culture that embraces individual courage. The liquor consumption is monumental. And so it provides a catalyst for trouble. By 1912, a study referred to the liquor problem among shiftless coal miners, and also cocaine is quite available. Folks don't think of cocaine this time period, but it's very easy to get. And many miners mix, I shouldn't say many, some miners mix the two together. A lot of these miners in the camps pursue drinking as the principal form of enjoyment. There's not a lot of other things to do, really. Saloons such as the infamous Red Rabbit. Now I'm cheating a little bit here. This is actually a saloon in what is now Summerlee. It was called Peril in that time period. This is the Red Rabbit, unfortunately not in Scarborough, where I'm talking about specifically, but this is the Red Rabbit Saloon in Carbondale. Red Rabbit seemed to be a very popular name for saloons, and I have no idea why. There must be something in the time period I'm not familiar with. But I can tell you, if a rabbit went into those places very often, he'd be red because there's a lot of blood there. Drunkenness is a problem. It's throughout the state's southern coalfields, not just Fayette County. One mine manager says, let's build a saloon first. That way, if the miners if they have access to liquor every day, they won't go on these binges, and they'll be at work. Of course, that's his idea. In reality, these miners work a life at daily risk underground. There are cultural mandates that require one to demonstrate bravery in dangerous situations and willingly endanger themselves in an effort to save others. And through my time in the mines, that was central to your thinking. You will risk your life to save a fellow worker, even if you don't like him. He's a fellow coal miner. Of course, there are many more regulations these days, but you had to demonstrate that sense of bravery. Now, in fact, when I say these early operations are dangerous, 1 in every 89 West Virginia miners could expect to be killed or seriously hurt in 1899. And now, I'm not talking about your broken finger or something like that. I'm talking about seriously hurt. And you'll find the death rate is quite high. Now, that's only for 1 year. Take the same number of miners. You're still working there year after year. That reduces the chances they're going to be seriously hurt or killed. The sociologist Rex Lucas noted that miners exhibiting bravely in risky situations, that enables those individuals to maintain one's own self-conception as a male. They embrace these guidelines of male honor in the workplace, and that easily translated to exhibitions of courage and pride by young hotheads who are in the saloons, the boarding houses. They're at the holiday celebrations. A lot of them appear to have what Roger McGrath, who studied the Western mining towns, what he termed reckless bravado, a willingness to exchange gunfire over a careless remark, an insult, a even to challenge the fighting ability. And admittedly, that wicked group of uncles, watch this might come back to haunt me. Uncles that I was around, particularly on one side of the family, they taught me this code very early on. And of course, whiskey consumption is going to increase that bravado. And when you couple that with the proliferation of firearms in the camps, and it was a proliferation, the result is these trivial confrontations become lethal rather quickly. The criminal court judge, Walter R. Bennett in Fayette County, very early in the century, he noted, he said, it's impossible. I get all these complaints, and folks say they can't hold church services because there's too many folks firing a pistol outside. It's very easy to get guns at the time. And I'll see how I did from here. That's an early saloon, but yeah. There's the boarding house. I apologize. Okay, this is from the Sears catalog in 1902. Now, when in my younger years, and I was talking to miners, and especially my grandfather, others talk about this time period, but I talked to other elderly miners in those days. Their preference was an Ivor Johnson. For one thing, it's smaller, easier to hide. Folks like the Colts that you see over on the right, but the average Colt is around, go to the Peacemaker a little farther up, it's around $12. Some of these cheaper guns over here, as you can see, $1.60, but you can get that Ivor Johnson for anywhere from $3 to $5, a little better model in some way. Now, obviously, one can immediately question, well, wait a minute, what were wages at that time? I crunched it, and it pretty much, for a miner who works every day, and he loads pretty well, he's paid by what he loads. The gun is as affordable as it is today for most folks. So there's lots of guns around. You can get guns in the company store. In fact, there are cases, I haven't found one in Fayette County, but there are cases where there's an argument outside. Someone goes in the company store, buys a pistol, and comes out and shoots the person they're angry at. In some cases, they get away with it. Colts were the most popular as far as what folks wanted to have, but that Ivor Johnson's a little better to place where most people carried a gun in the time period. Roger McGrath noted that individuals in the western mining town of Bodie carried their guns in a coat or a hip pocket, not a holster. And I used to hear my grandfather say that, and I heard another gentleman, a couple other gentlemen that I knew who were of his generation, about placing this Ivor Johnson in the hip pocket. And as I went through the cases in Fayette County, that's what I found time and time again. Then I happened to be watching a film from 1915, and the character in that, a silent film, of course, and the character in that film, the only one who had the gun, had it in his hip pocket. And I realized how popular that must have been at the time period. In reading accounts and looking at the court transcripts of many of these incidents, this was a common factor. Somebody had a gun in their hip pocket. However, that could lead to some interesting, humorous, if it wasn't so deadly, episodes. Oftentimes, and two individuals get in an argument, and someone's trying to get that pistol out of that hip pocket, and they either shoot themselves, or oftentimes they'll drop it. There was a case outside of Mount Hope. No, actually, it was on Keeney Street, at a place called Blue Goose. The argument ensued. One gentleman tried to get the pistol out of his pocket. He dropped it. His foe picked it up and shot him and killed him. So it does. These gunfights don't come off the way they do in Hollywood. I will say, I did find one episode where two miners who were arguing about a female who ran a boarding house agreed to meet in the street of Rush Run early in the morning. And they actually did walk out into the street, such as the street was in Rush Run, draw their pistols and shoot at one another. One was killed. Even on the mine sites, you can see miners playing with guns. And I actually went through a case where someone was accidentally shot that way and murdered. And it, of course, became a court case. But even on the mine sites themselves, pocket and pistols came into play. At Dunloop number 2 mine, which is fairly near Glenjean, between Glenjean and Mount Hope, a fellow named Herbert Turnbull was a 19-year-old native of Virginia, and he was a transient mine worker. And he was sitting sideways on one of the operations mules as he rode the animal to the barn from the surface. There was a young mule driver who was a West Virginia native who met Turnbull at the barn, and he said he placed his hand on the mule and he playfully observed. He said, "Look out, old Snowball will run away with you." Turnbull, the older miner, he took offense at this and he threatened McNear, but the other fellow didn't show any fear, and so Turnbull simply drew his pistol from his pocket and he said, "I'll show you," and he mortally wounded this young man. That's all it was said. He just said, "Watch out there, old Snowball will run away with you." I get offended, and then pulls out a gun and shoots him. In many cases, these folks who are shot are not armed. They will get in arguments. Someone will walk out of boarding. In some cases, they will challenge someone to a fight. They're in the boarding house, they get in an argument. So fine, let's go outside. They'll wait till the other person walks down the steps and shoot them in the back. As far as honor, it's a difficult situation. There's so much honor in it sometimes. Let me skip over some things. In the coalfields, as in the American West, these events symbolize what came to be called hip pocket ethics. That was a term used in the time period. It's centered on the reality that an adversary may well have a firearm on his person, and if you try to run away, you may get shot in the back. So, as such, this philosophy added to something that was culturally mandated at the time, and that's courage, and the courage of a, quote, true man. You are to stand your ground in deadly showdowns. Even the famous American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes came to believe that people had the right to stand their ground. For Holmes, the approach suited human nature, and undoubtedly many men in the coalfields, they agreed. With firearms and a philosophy centered on hip pocket ethics, basically, then many Fayette miners they're out there, they will seek amusement, they end up in arguments, and they're prone to getting into card games, shooting craft, getting rowdy in saloons, and they will square off rather quickly. And of course, this kind of playing will lead to this. And it's a pretty common sight here. Now, I will qualify this. I do believe that this individual was killed in the mine, but it gets the point across, and it's the only one I could find along these lines. But while the miners made use of this hip pocket ethics philosophy, the West Virginia court judges found themselves wrestling with the frontier embrace of the old English legal embrace of, you have the right to stand your ground. I was taught that growing up. You have no duty to retreat. And the variety of court cases and jury decisions in Fayette at the time suggest that the early miners and the general population had come to embrace some degree of this legal theory that one could and should stand his ground. What had happened in American jurisprudence as well as in England is there had been a shift to your back has to be against the wall. But that for those who are actually in these situations, waiting till your back's against the wall could lead to defeat, as you might say. The Governor William Glasscock of West Virginia, he cited this older English standard of self-defense. You have the right to stand your ground. And so there was a constant, some cases would be some individuals in their court cases would be found guilty because they hadn't waited until their back was against the wall. In other cases, it was considered self-defense. He didn't have to wait that long. There's no way to pin down how the judges and the jury are thinking at the time. It's something that both the governors and the courts are wrestling with, especially in the coalfields. And as you might guess, elections, major holiday celebrations, they produce these legal In 1904, the election week in Fayette County produced 8 homicides in the county. That's just in the county. That's not unusual for Fayette County. The co-operator W.P. Tams remembered that particular week in 1904, but oftentimes there will be 18 and 19 murder cases in a term of court. The homicides became common throughout the county during this cold frontier period. Men died as a result of arguments as trivial as the proper ownership of shoes. Late January 1906, a generalized fracas erupted at the Saturday night opening of New Saloon in Stewart, which is present-day Log Alley. And several men with reckless bravado entered into the row, and these big rows in saloons is not uncommon. That's when the bartenders usually get killed. In the contest, Edward Bays lost an ear, apparently as a result of a miner striking him alongside the head with a beer bottle. In this case, Bays had no weapon to pull from his pocket, but he requested a Colt 38 from someone else. He threatened his adversary. His adversary said, "Go ahead." So he did, and he killed him. Obviously, as I said, the males are going to dominate this scene here in Fayette County on this frontier. But as I mentioned earlier, women participated in this chorus of violence, and it is a chorus. As might be expected, Coalfield females committed homicide against aggressive males, as well as other women. In 1903, Florence Cheeks moved from Dunlop Creek to Berry in Fayette County with her miner husband. There was a younger woman there, a woman named Laura Mitchell, who lived with the Cheeks, and rumors suggested that there was some jealous quarreling going on. The young man was paying more attention to the unmarried female. So Cheeks made good on, Cheeks had been threatening this younger woman, and she made good on her threat by waiting until Mitchell went to sleep and then shot her with a .38 caliber pistol. Of course, women killed wayward or unwanted husbands. Italian women in particular, for whatever reason, I can't pin it down, they tended to favor shotguns. Maybe they didn't want to miss. I'm not sure. But other females actually received admiration for their marksmanship skills. Martha Sales was a black woman in the Big Q coal camp near Quinamon. She came concerned about a fellow named Wilson Brown. He threatened to kill her. So she decided, well, I'm not going to give him time to do this, to get closer, make good on his promise. You know, he's standing at a distance. So she drew a bead on her target, as they said at the time. And from about 60 feet away, she shot him through the eye and killed him. And that's just one example of women who are quite accurate with pistols. Actually, what the local newspaper said was that Sales was a good markswoman. And some women, such as Mary Young, who was at Dunlop, she easily fit the definition of a tough customer. She favored making use of a razor on adversaries. And her threatening behavior, she was a pretty rough individual, resulted in her being shot, and she was wounded on 2 different occasions within a short 2-month period. In a 2-month period, she was shot twice. Women that came to the Fayette Coalfields made a living by entertaining miners, of course. Some came in and attached themselves to men in some fashion, but they all ran the potential of getting into dangerous alliances with habitually desperate characters attracted to the hustle and bustle of the region. The reality is, if a person has criminal tendencies, wild tendencies, where are you going to go? You're going to go where you can be wild. If you're a gambler, where are you going to go? You're going to go where these card games are going on, things of that sort. Many of these women were like many of the men, they were transient individuals, and many of them were shot. They were wounded with knives and razors, that sort of thing. But unattached females who came into that region, and if they had a, quote, history, I'm referring to here, they needed to be aware of the volatility that was in the area. One of the most interesting cases I came across was in October of 1905. A woman named Molly Gibson, who was a woman known to have lived a, quote, checkered life. She became careless with her flirtation while attending a dance at the Claremont camp on New River. Her current lover, who was a miner named Joe Thompson, became aware of her behavior, and Thompson entered the festivities there at the dance with a Winchester. He killed Gibson and calmly walked away unmolested by either local patrons or the authorities. The evidence is scant, but it seems to be that this unfortunate woman's public reputation limited any official willingness to chase down Thompson, who had killed her. Well, the idea was she got what she asked for. And conflicts regarding the affections of women between black colliers appears to exceed those among white miners. Undoubtedly, much of the tension came from very simple math. That's the gender demographics of the region. Countywide in 1910, females constituted 40% of the black population, with about 150 males for every 100 females. But in all probability, that overall number doesn't apply to that area, to the areas along White Oak Creek and Arbuckle Creek, where Dixon's putting in his operation. The disparity is probably even greater there, and so there's competition for various females. So as a result, as you might expect, black males join in the frontier-style frenzy of this region quickly. In Windgrove, which is very near Glenjean, there had been confrontation between the two black miners. They had been arguing about a woman. The woman had already chosen one of these individuals. Even though she had chosen him, he decided to get rid of the competition, simply walked by him one day and turned a shotgun on him without saying a word and killed him. The miners would argue over 10 cents, the price of a whiskey shot at the time. And in one case, they're arguing over a loan of 10 cents. One miner's trying to get the 10 cents out. The other one shoots him with a Winchester and just rolled him over the hill there at the Kanawha River. Overall, these deadly altercations of one sort or another had become so common throughout the county that in 1903, the Fayette Journal referred to the recent Independence Day, which had led to lots of murders, as what they called a quiet Fourth. They said, there were only 3 homicides this weekend, this day. So that's a quiet Fourth for Fayette County. The basis for this observation, this is what we're used to: 6, 7 shooting homicides, not to count all the various shootings and other things that go on. So if we only have 3 or 4, well, that's a calm weekend. And what this assessment does is it provides a powerful indication of the exceedingly high level of violent altercations in the coal field. Brandon, I don't know where we started late. I've forgotten where I'm at time-wise. Okay. The word of violence in Fayette County spread out beyond the state, and other out-of-state newspapers, such as the New York World and the Washington Post, criticized at one point Governor Albert B. White because he didn't quell the violence that's going on. They said he needed to hang more people. And then one paper noted, well, wait a minute, nobody's hanged since he's been governor, which is not quite accurate. But an Ohio newspaper referred to Fayette's early coal operation, Fayette County itself, as the meanest county in the entire nation. And they probably weren't far off with that. Governor White insisted that it was just an increase of violence caused by the growth of the population. But the Moundsville warden at the time, Charles Haddocks, he mathematically demonstrated quite easily that the governor was incorrect. Coal miners incarcerated or sentenced to hang for violent crimes far exceeded the ratio of the population growth. White was just looking for a political angle. One of the interesting stories I came across, which fascinated me, it was just by accident. Governor White had concern about the practice of pardoning prisoners who were terminally ill. And their condition, based on what the prison authorities could see, their condition meant they would die within a 3-month period. But White was nervous about this. He continued to follow the pattern. They established a pardon board to look into it as well. he would take their advice, and he would pardon those who they determined were going to die. Now, the reality is some of them probably would have died if they'd stayed in mountain prison, but once they're released, they get healthier. But the most famous of these cases, which really came back to haunt. Sorry, I got to rambling and I forgot to put the women up here. They like a bottle too. They're no different than the men, as you can see there. Actually, I'd like to join that party. It looks pretty good, to be honest with you. And I have joined those type parties in the past. But I apologize for that. I was thinking about the time. I'm trying to speed up some. White gets into an embarrassing situation based on a member of a famous Southern West Virginia family. And that was Elias Hatfield. Hatfield had what was contemporarily referred to as consumption, which is, of course, tuberculosis, or pulmonary tuberculosis. And that represented a health concern for the rest of the prison population. And tuberculosis did run rampant in mountains. The prisoner, Elias Hatfield, who was, of course, the young son of the famous feudist Daniel Hance, he suffered from the disease, and White received a request to pardon this mortally ill patient. Now, Hatfield had been convicted of killing Humphrey Ellis, who was an individual that had previously apprehended John Hatfield and turned him over to Kentucky authorities. Elias had a 12-year sentence that was issued in December of 1899. Spring of 1901, the acting prison physician informed the pardon board. He says, well, Hatfield is suffering from the final stages of tuberculosis. He faces imminent death. He'll be dead within 3 months, and no more than 6 months if he's released. And they don't want tuberculosis to spread. So based on the agency's recommendations, Hatfield was pardoned. White then noticed that Elias Hatfield's been pardoned in April 4th. Now, he's pardoned, it's done. They can't rearrest him. He's been pardoned. And White says, well, wait a minute. This is September, and Hatfield hasn't died. And he exhibited no signs that he was going to die. So the governor gets a little nervous about this, and he questions the unfulfilled outcome. And the president of the pardon board said, well, the pardoning power is not infallible. These things happen. There's no method of preventing an occasional miscarriage of justice. I couldn't find anything specifically about it, but you can only imagine White's thoughts when he heard in 1907 that Elias Hatfield, who was going to die, had pursued a runaway worker for some 40 miles and then wounded the worker and captured this Italian who had escaped from that peonage to the Ritter Lumber Company. White was undoubtedly embarrassed regarding his Hatfield pardon, but he must have felt a little bit of satisfaction in 1911 when the news came that a reasonably healthy Elias Hatfield and his brother Troy had fell in that famous three-way Fayette County Coal Town gun battle with an Italian who was selling liquor, and all three of them were killed. But Hatfield fooled the governor, and he just refused to die. Frontier conditions continued in several of Fayette County's coal towns well into the second decade of the 20th century. In fact, one of my aunts refused to allow two of my cousins, my older cousins, to roam down to Rush Run, which had quite a reputation on the river, as the camp, even though the camp was rapidly disintegrating by that point. It was the mine working out. And I wish to add, those two cousins proved to be a couple of the roughest customers I've ever known, and they wouldn't go to Rush Run. They even sewed each other up after knife fights. But you don't go to Rush Run. How am I on time? I got two of Fayette County's coal camp murder cases. I've used in presentations before, but they're so interesting, and we'll take a brief look at, because both of them exemplify many of the themes I've touched on here. One is the case of miner Jesse Briggs, who's terribly in love, and the strange and truly complex case of Lud Madison. I remain fascinated about these cases, particularly Madison. I have driven hundreds of miles trying to track down information on this, and I've been lucky to have some real success at Jesse Briggs, the first, he came to Fayette County from Albemarle County, Virginia. Excuse me. And he came in 1897. He soon found himself caught up in the previously noted competition for females. In 1903, this 22-year-old male he's located at the extensive mining complex at Harvey on Dunlop Creek. That's maybe a fourth of the way from Glen Jean down to Thurman. When he was questioned about gun carrying, Briggs noted, he said, well, I generally carry a gun. And again, most miners do in the time period. So when he was conducting domestic business and visiting in the area of Glen Jean and Dunlop, he observed that he put his .38 caliber Ivor Johnson, as we talked about before, in his pocket. His socializing brought him into contact with someone I mentioned before, Mary Young. Now that's the razor-wielding hellion. It's wounded twice. He developed a great deal of apparently one-sided attraction. By late September, Mary Young, who had been wounded, had returned to a shanty in Harvey. What she had done, she pulled a razor on a man who responded. He was a little faster, I suppose, and he shot her in the arm. The statements vary about it, and I went over the court case, the transcript. I managed to ferret out many court transcripts, and it's extremely difficult to do. The statements vary, but it does seem most likely that while she was wounded, she took advantage of Briggs's attraction to her. And when Briggs came to her shanty, soon after she was wounded, he found Young lying on the floor with no one to provide any help. So he's infatuated with this woman. He takes the opportunity to demonstrate his affection, and he takes her into his own shanty, where he could see to her needs. Young quickly improved, and she began spending a good deal of time in the Dunlop Creek area. Pretty soon she's roaming around. She's not paying any attention to Briggs, and Briggs is, of course, quite upset. And Briggs goes out looking for her. She was at a home on Dunlop Creek where lots of, let's say, unattached females had been assembling off and on. And she's sitting on the bed with another individual. Briggs arrives, he roams around in the house there, talks to some other people, then he walks in the room where Mary Young is sitting on the bed with this other gentleman. And he looks at her and he says, Mary, you have done me wrong. Mary, you have done me dirty. And Young's greeting back to him was, here is that SOB. I cleaned it up. So, whether or not Briggs had already drawn his weapon is unclear. It's not clear whether or not Young advanced at him with a razor. The testimonies of the survivors was all over the place. Whatever the case, Briggs fired his .38 4 times. He struck Young in the hand, and her suitor, who was sitting there with her, he struck him in the abdomen. Young falls on the floor. Her suitor tries to run out the door, but he collapsed just outside, and he dies. Here's the interesting story with Briggs. I don't know why these guys would do such a thing. Briggs flees into the woods. He hides his weapon. He goes down to Glen Jean, gets behind the coke ovens, and makes his way down the railroad tracks in the evening, and makes his escape back to Virginia. He's scot-free. But he can't get Mary Young out of his mind, so he runs back to Fayette County. He's arrested, and he's sent to Moundsville to be executed. He was scot-free, but this woman, who's already causing this much of a problem, is so attractive to him that he'll risk coming back. The interesting thing about Briggs, I tended to lean toward, in the court case itself, the testimonies, I tended to lean toward Briggs' story early on until I found out that his sentence was commuted to life in Moundsville. And in Moundsville, he was actually killed by the guards when he tried to attack some guards. So he obviously had a volatile character. The other case, again, is the one that fascinates me probably the most of all of them I've come across. And I've spoken on it several times, but The case of Lud Madison remains the strangest I have ever encountered in my research. And it's hard to make all the pieces fit together. The cause of Lud Madison, because that case is why I tracked down and was able to find many of the trial transcripts. No one knew where such things existed. At the end of my research on Madison, I actually tracked down his letter to the governor. And I was only able to do that because of research I'd done when I was doing mine disasters. But Madison's case occurred on Laurel Creek near Quinamon. If you go to Grandview State Park today, you look at the main overlook, looking down at the bend in the river there, that's Quinamon is right in the area. And what happened evolved from the things we've been talking about, young men with bravado and so forth. And there's lots of legal wrangling that get involved in this case. And it's very hard to follow. In fact, it's one of the strangest episodes in West Virginia jurisprudence. Lud Madison, he was a young black miner from Virginia. He shared his small double shanty. Now, sometimes they doubled the shanties up. They just sort of put them together. And he's in there. There are four of them in the shanty. They live in close quarters. They have occasional heated arguments between one individual, Peter Swader, who usually argued with another of the roommates, John Johnson. Madison had never exchanged cross words with any of them. And what's going to happen here is something is a code. It's a part of a code that I knew as a miner all those years, taught by my father. I just knew it. I'll refer to it here in a moment because it's central to this whole case. In May of 1899, Madison, who's a highly religious man, he and Peter Swader, then were roughing. They were playing checkers until shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening. They're in the shanty. One of the two brothers who were roommates, Charlie Jordan, actually slept in the same bed with Madison. He suggested everyone should go to sleep if they were going to work the next day. The two players just simply shrugged it off, and they continued the game to its conclusion. And then they stood up peacefully laughing about the match. Everything's fine at that point. Swader asked Madison for a piece of Madison's bread, that bread that Madison had baked earlier in the day. And Madison responded with, "Cook your own bread." After Swader had walked into the other room, Madison called out and said, "I'm feeding my bread to the hogs," which is a bit of an insult. It was probably just playful bantering. But Swader, who tended to swear a lot, and that's the key, even though he swore a lot, he had never done so to the religious Madison. But in reaction to this last comment, Swader responded, and he said, "You're just throwing that to keep me from it. I don't want none of your damn bread now." And I left out a word. To that remark, Madison answered, "Don't you cuss me." That's the core of it. If you want trouble among my generation of coal miners, my dad's generation, my grandfather's generation, if you're angry, that's okay. You can talk. If you curse at the other individual, Katie bar the door. I don't care who it is. It's the ball peen hammer I carried in the mines along my toes would come out quickly if someone cursed me. That's what's going on here. It's a code that a lot of modern people don't understand. That's their loss because it is respect for that other individual. That's what's happened here. So Madison yells back, and again, Swader has a bad reputation, and he says, when he says, don't you cuss me, Swader says, "Don't take it if you don't like it," which he's inviting him. He's inviting trouble then. Madison said, "Cuss me again and I won't." This challenge only brought about a torrent of cursing on the part of Swader. Madison, who had started preparing for his bed, at that last remark, he pulled his suspenders up and he left the building. Swader simply engaged himself. It's really interesting. He'd received new straw to actually make himself improve his bed at the time, which they slept on straw, it gets smashed down, things happen to it, get lice and everything else, and you change that straw out occasionally. It had actually been sent to him from his home in Virginia. Madison returned in about an hour. He sat down at the foot of his bed and he began writing a letter to his mother. Everyone except Madison fell asleep. But shortly after 1 o'clock, the Shannymake cousins, Charlie and his brother Joe Jordan, they woke to the noise of 2 gunshots. And so the Jordans, they go into the other room, they try to wake Squater, who's groaning and he's trying to turn over a bit, and then they notice blood on his undershirt. And then they concluded rather quickly that he had died, and they go and find the mine superintendent. Assuming Madison probably intended to make his way back home to Virginia, officials quickly telephoned authorities in the railroad town of Hinton, told them to watch out for a black man who was carrying a satchel. Hinton's chief of police actually did catch Madison walking on the tracks, placed him under arrest, even though Madison gave him a false name. On the train ride back to the Justice of the Peace office on Laurel Creek, Madison joined in the general conversation. He acted like he was ignorant of the murder, but he slipped up. When there's a lull in the dialogue, and the officer suddenly asked Madison, he said, "Why did you shoot Swader?" And the miner broke character. He said, "Because he cursed me." And next morning, Charlie Jordan discovers a letter from Madison. And Madison had written him, he said, "Charlie, I will ask you to draw my money, send it to my mother, Emily Madison, Green Bay, Virginia. Charlie, I hate to leave you. I don't like it. I will not take Peter's cursing. I am no dog. I hope the Lord will be with you all. This is from your friend. Please mail my letter." Jordan managed to mail the letter to Madison's mother, but officials confiscated the wages that he had to pay for sending Squader's body back to Coldwell, Virginia. And this is where the story begins to really get complicated. Madison had certainly committed a cold-blooded murder. He deserved the gallows. We get right down to it. He shot this fellow in cold blood. However, there's an overtaxed legal system at the time. Pretty soon it manages to draw Madison into a lengthy punishment that he could not have foreseen, really. No one could have foreseen this. Madison's trial began in late afternoon, October 24th, 1899. When he was asked if he had representation, Madison responded, he said, "Well, I had the name of a firm that had been given him by an official." But he said, "I don't have an attorney. No one has come to discuss the case." The judge, James Dunbar in Fayette County, stopped. He paused for a moment, and then he said, there were 3 relatively inexperienced lawyers who had just finished up a case, and he assigned them to Madison's defense. They've just met the guy. And Dunbar, he wants to start the trial immediately. So he agreed to permit the attorneys to talk with Madison in an outer room, but he kept interrupting them, telling them, "Let's get started." So there was a 20-minute preparation for this guy's defense. And to be honest, a couple of the jurors were probably drunk. I had trouble chasing it down, but I'm fairly convinced they were drunk. For all I know, the judge was drunk. After the trial begins, as you might guess, it doesn't last very long. The jury returns a guilty verdict the next day, and Dunbar sentences Madison to be hanged on December 15th. Incensed about the court's handling of the entire episode, the defense attorneys quickly testify in depositions about the improper handling of the trial. Governor Atkinson grants a 30-day reprieve in order to allow the defense attorneys to submit the writ of error to the appeals court. Atkinson then issues a death warrant requiring Madison's execution on January 13th. So all this gets started there in October. Only 5 days from the gallows, 5 days, he's watching the calendar, so to speak. Madison learned that the Supreme Court of Appeals agreed to review his case, so he gets to take a breath. 14 months passed before the state appellate court affirmed the judgment. But the jurists neglected to remand the case back to the Fayette County Court. Governor White comes in, and he inherits the situation in 1901. And he pointed out to Dunbar, he said, "Well, Madison has remained in Moundsville without an execution date. Fayette County records listed Madison as already dead because that execution date had passed. So Fayette County says the guy's dead. Supreme Court of Appeals says, well, he has to be executed. Here's the new execution date." So White insisted on a resentencing before he would permit the execution to occur. Reluctantly, the court issues an order for the prisoner's return from Moundsville prison. Madison stands at the Fayette County Courthouse stoically, and he listens to Dunbar re-sentence him for execution. Madison's attorneys requested a stay of execution. Once again, they want to meet with the pardon board. White says, legally, Fayette County has no jurisdiction in this. And accordingly, on August 30th, it's been almost a year, the governor grants an additional 60 days to give time for an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. Madison now has a new execution date, November 12th. This goes through 5 episodes. And he has a great deal of mental anguish for this, as you might guess. And he's anticipating the gallows over and over again. So on August 13th, this condemned coal miner wrote to the governor. And I actually found the letter. I know you can't read it. I'll read it to you here, but it's rather powerful. Dear Governor, you will recall me by name as the man who in the eyes of the law is dead. The law says he's already dead. But I am alive in flesh and suffering untold agony. Dead, but yet alive with the uncertainty. My dear sir, I am still in my uncertain position I was before, and the mental struggle seems more than I can bear. Can you not understand the terrible mental distress I am suffering? And he says, he's suffering this day by day. It seems almost unbearable, for it has become a nightmare. A nightmare in daylight and a demon in darkness. And you can well imagine it. Never out of my thoughts. For over a year, he keeps expecting to gallop. You ask in vain, I hope not. And in conclusion, I beg you will have mercy and forgive me and relieve me from this uncertain position. Now, what actually happens is White responds and says, I wish I could help you, but you just need to manfully meet your fate. Unknown to Madison, White was watching another case, and he was able to come up with a way to actually commute Madison's sentence to life. Madison was 24 when he went to prison, 22. He died when he was 24. I think I may be off a little bit on that, while he was in prison from syphilis. This was the poor run of Glen Jean. These early coal mining camps, this is what these western mining towns, it's worth noting that you have to be careful with this. If you get down to actuality, just like the mining camps out west, again, that were more dangerous than the cow towns, in actuality, they're not particularly dangerous places for the average miner who doesn't frequent saloons or join games of chance. The same thing's true out west is true in Fayette County. There are some cases of innocent bystanders becoming victims of gunplay, but those are quite rare. Additionally, cultural codes prevent violence against the old, the weak, and the innocent. In relatively few cases, vigilante justice in Fayette during all this violence didn't erupt. It came close once when an elderly man was killed down in Boomer. He was shot in the back by some young ruffians. And there was a case where a young boy had been molested in Glen Jean, and the authorities managed to get him out of there and have him punished through the system rather than what was about to happen. But at the time, and this is all forgotten, and this is important to this whole study, and I'm trying to hustle along, but at the time, Fayette's law enforcement included a popularly elected justices of the peace and a constable, or sometimes two constables, within a magisterial district. Those are the primary law enforcement. Fayette included 7 magisterial districts with 2 squires and usually 2 constables each. Locally elected constables, technically they hold police powers throughout the state, but primarily they serve, they are the enforcement officer within the squire's district. Of course, this rapidly expanding number of rudimentary coal camps is going to tax a magisterial district that has only 2 constables and sometimes just 1. Now, on occasion, a constable will appoint someone else as a temporary constable, but it's dangerous business. Usually what happens is the ruffians won't listen to them and they get killed. So we begin to stop doing that. But what it means is these coal camps means that these constables are rather few and far between, and it makes effective law enforcement impossible. Transportation to various camps proved problematic because most of the branch rail lines concentrated primarily on coal haulage. So as such, by the time a constable receives word of a problem and he travels to the location, the perpetrators had time to escape. Still, with that reality in mind, in none, not one of these violent, non-labor strike-oriented cases within these coal camps have I uncovered one, not one, case in which a hired mine guard becomes involved. In fact, the only murder case I found involving a mine guard, in the sense we tend to think of them, one has to be careful. There are plenty of mine guards who were folks who were injured underground, and so they called them guards for a while they make people don't steal coal. They may guard a railroad cut at night, things of that sort. But the guard, the way we think of it in the traditional sense, a hired guard who's somewhat of a professional, usually a professional felon. The only case I came across in Fayette County in this heyday where a guard's involved is a case when a mine guard was killed by a young man who challenged the guard's right to tell him what to do. When the guard punched him, he pulled out a pistol quickly and shot him and killed him. And Justice Collins worked hard to try to get this guy hanged. Instead, he was let go because he had been assaulted by a mine guard. What I'm getting at here is back to what I said early on. We need to be careful about extrapolating what goes on when there's labor strife and apply that to the everyday life in coal camps. I'm not saying that there aren't cases where mine guards are quite active in this sort of thing all the time. But I'm saying we can't apply it across the board. Thanks. I hope I didn't go too long. If there's any questions, I'll do my best. Thank you.